Creative people are both simultaneously crazier than the average person and more sane than the average person. Our brains were meant to solve problems, to understand, to figure out what's going on. And so highly creative people are just some people who happen to be able to have a wide range of ideas. But everyone does this. Everyone, if you're curious enough, you can absolutely solve important problems in an original and hopefully meaningful way.
What drew you specifically to the connection between creativity and scientists?
So when I did my meta-analysis, it was on personality and creativity, but I split it up by science and art.
How do you separate these two, and what were the different things you found?
If you're really sad and something really traumatic has happened, one of the ways to make sense of it is to write a song about it, or write a novel, or express it in your painting, or do something with it. It's a very creative form of therapy, really. So that's something that's different also. Scientists tend not to have that background. Artists kind of working through internal stuff and scientists trying to figure out external stuff.
After decades of studying creativity, what is the biggest unanswered question about creativity for you? When we think of creativity, we tend to think of artists. My guest today has spent his career widening that lens by showing that some of the most creative minds on earth belong to scientists, and that the creative person can be studied with the same rigor we bring to anything else in psychology. Gregory Feist is a professor of psychology at the San Jose State University and one of the most influential voices in the study of creativity and personality. He grew up surrounded by the field. His father was a psychology professor, and the two of them went on to co-author a widely used textbook on personality. Greg earned his doctorate at Berkeley, where he worked alongside Frank Barron, one of the founding figures of modern creativity research. He is perhaps best known for conducting the first large-scale meta-analysis of personality and creativity, a landmark study that shaped how we understand the creative personality and how creative scientists and creative artists differ from one another. He is also the founder of an entire field, the psychology of science, which asks how scientific thinking, talent, and interest take root in a person, sometimes as early as infancy, and why that spark so often fades as we grow. His book on this subject was awarded the William James Book Prize. His work travels from the creativity of great scientists to the nurturing of young talent, to a puzzle that feels especially urgent today. Why the same species that builds science can so readily fall for pseudoscience and turn away from evidence. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Greg, and welcome to the Creativity Dialogs podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored that you asked me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Likewise. I'd like to begin with the person, getting to know you. Before the research, tell us a bit about your childhood and the experiences that shaped how you see the world. How did you get interested in psychology?
Well, there's both a simple and a less simple story, but the simple story is my father, in fact, was a psychology professor. And growing up, though, I had no interest in that. I wanted to be a baseball player. And then by the time I was a teenager and I realized I was good enough to, play baseball, but I wasn't good enough to be a professional, I started thinking of other things. And then I started reading. My dad had some philosophy books in the house, and so I started reading philosophy. at like 16, and we had to read for school. And I really got into philosophical ideas. I read Henry David Thoreau, and I started thinking. And then at 17, I applied for and went to Germany for my senior year of high school. I was an exchange student, so I lived with a German family. I went to a German school. They had 3 small children, and they also were interested in the host father was a physics and math teacher at the gymnasium, which is kind of their university track high school. And then my host mother was a medical doctor researcher. And so the host father also had philosophy of science stuff in his home. So I started reading, Karl Popper and other people in philosophy of science, and I started getting really, really interested in philosophy. Is the bottom line. But even with all that, I was always interested in thinking and ideas and how knowledge. I mean, that was kind of the part of philosophy that I got into, epistemology, which is, of course, what knowledge is, the nature of knowledge, how do we know, and so on. So I was always interested in knowledge and thinking. And there was a little time where I thought about being an architect, but I was always interested in how do new things.
Why architecture?
Well, see, that's the thing. I think it was because also this is when I was like 12 or 13, my family added on to our house because we had 5 children and we only had 3 bedrooms total. So it was 2. So I remember basically, here's what I'm thinking, the best I can come up with, because I've thought about this before. All of a sudden, our house became something different. It was just some idea that my dad had or whatever. And all of a sudden, a year later or whatever, it was a different thing. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. Something new came out into existence. So I was always kind of interested in how new things, why do some people think of things in a creative way? And so architecture is that. Architects obviously are creating new and novel ways of designing buildings and so on. So that was just always in my, so going back to high school, I was interested in creativity. So as an undergraduate, even though I started off in philosophy, I ended up switching to psychology. I was always interested in not just thinking, but novel, creative, original thinking. Like, why is it that some people change the world with their thinking? The big people in the world, the artists, scientists, musicians, writers. And so that was always, even as an undergraduate. And then so UC Berkeley had the kind of premier institute of personality assessment and research. So they were doing this research on personality and creativity back in the 1950s. This was people like Frank Barron and Harrison Goff and Donald McKinnon and Ravenna Helson. And so I applied. I went to University of Massachusetts, and then I applied to Berkeley for graduate school. And fortunately, I got accepted. And so that was really a foundational time for me to be working with the people who've done some of the main work in the field of personality and creativity. So, by the way, I should also say I glossed over something. So my dad was a psych professor, and even though I went to the University of Massachusetts, I ended up there. But I
have to interrupt you.
Yeah.
What were your conversations like at the dinner table? I mean, I'm just curious that.
Well, you would think that we talked about this, but we really didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
I mean, it wasn't until I was in Germany that I even thought. All of a sudden, when I was in Germany, I had this epiphany that I wanted to be a professor. I had never thought that before at all.
Do you think that the cultural difference, how did that impact you? Because you suddenly land up in Germany where culturally things are very different.
Well,
how did you
there's no doubt.
with that?
There's no doubt that's important. And what I mean by that is, it completely, being an exchange student at 17 and 18 completely changed my way of thinking and my view of myself and the world. As an American, we tend to be pretty isolated. We tend to not, tend to think that the world revolves around the U.S., which it doesn't.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden, I'm here, a young person, and I'm exposed to a different way of thinking, a different family, a different culture. And it really all of a sudden, all the things you take for granted, like the way I think of it is, it's
Yeah.
like, in what you take for granted are the things you don't even know, but you do,
Exactly.
because they're
Yes.
part of your culture.
Mhm.
And so it's like a fish in water doesn't recognize the water, or you don't
Yes.
recognize your own accent because everyone has the
Mhm.
same accent. All of a
Exactly.
sudden, you live in another culture, and
Mhm.
you know this. But when you're that young, especially, and you're living in a different culture, all of a sudden your mind just opens up, and you start thinking about things very differently. And I think that's inherent in the creative process, is
Yes.
being able to have multiple perspectives at the same
Mhm.
time,
Yeah.
which is, I think, central to creative thinking.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
that it brings about openness,
exactly.
which just keeps you easygoing. You're just able to focus on what's important. You're not caught up
Well, and you're flexible and
with
you're thinking.
yes.
You realize that, again, there's different ways to think about things, and different perspectives and different ideas and different
Hmm.
values. So no, it's actually. And by the way, I'll just jump to this right now, just briefly. My research and other people's research has shown that a lot of the best, most creative, eminent scientists, many of them are multicultural, bicultural, first generation. The Nobel laureates are 30%. For the American Nobel laureates, like 30% of them are foreign born. Um, and so, no, there's absolutely no doubt. And when I was in Italy for the last couple of summers teaching a culture and personality class, we talked about that too. Is like how
Mm,
um, being bicultural facilitates, right, flexible thinking,
completely.
openness,
Yes.
um,
Absolutely.
and that's the key trait in personality
Mhm.
of highly creative people, openness. But
Yeah.
it's not just openness in thinking; it is also openness in behavior and attitude.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, no, that's why I love traveling.
Yeah.
Still,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Tell us about your work. How would you describe what you study, and how did you get into it?
Well, so I kind of touched on it a second ago, which is, Berkeley was the place that was my first choice for graduate
Mm.
school, and because my dad was not only a psychology professor, he ended up teaching a course in personality. In fact, I took that. I was about to say that a minute ago. My last year in my first 2 years of college, I went to where my dad teaches in Louisiana, which is where I grew up
So
in this.
was he happy that you decided to get into the same
Yeah, I think
profession?
so. I think so. Yeah, I mean, I was always very proud, even though I didn't want to be a professor as a child. I was
Uh-huh.
always super proud. I was like, wow, being a professor, that's like the best thing.
Mhm.
I was very proud
Yeah.
of my dad that he was a professor, and everyone in town, he
You
was a
know.
good professor. People knew him. They would say, "Oh my God,
Mhm.
I had your dad, and he was great." And I
Yeah.
always was very impressed and proud that he did that.
Mhm.
I think, and I
Mhm.
still to this day think being a professor is one of the best things you can do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, you
Absolutely.
know, so anyway, I took this class on personality from him, and so I was really interested in personality. And so in Berkeley, that was their focus, was personality and creative
Mm.
people. So what are the
Mhm.
personality qualities and
Mm.
traits? So that's what I did, and that's why I went to Berkeley to study. And so I was really interested in and back I was in graduate school in the mid to late 80s and then early 90s, and the Big Five was just now happening. In fact,
Mhm.
Oliver John was hired in our department at Berkeley. He was one of the first main proponents of the Big Five. But before that, people like Harrison Goff, they had other measures, and Frank Barron was one of my heroes. I don't know if you know Frank Barron's work, but
A little.
yeah, he actually had a book back in the '60s, I guess it was, called Personality and Mental Health. I mean, sorry, Creativity and Mental Health. And he said something that really resonated with me, which is that creative people are both simultaneously crazier than the average person and more sane than the average person.
Mhm.
They have a wide range of ways of thinking. They think so differently that it can be. I mean, he's using those words kind of in quotes, but so the personality angle was always something that intrigued me. It's like, who are these people and what kind of traits of personality do they have? Are there some traits that make people more likely to be really creative? And again, as I said, this was before the Big Five was really taking off. And openness was, Raymond Cattell and Don McKinnon and Frank Barron and even Hans Eysenck. These are all the classic people in the 50s and 60s. They were talking about personality, and Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, all these well-known psychologists were all talking about creativity and personality. So anyway, so that's what I was interested in. And in particular in science, because I was always interested in the philosophy of science and scientific knowledge. And so I was interested in how do scientists solve problems creatively. And that was kind of how I ended up working on my dissertation, interviewing famous creative scientists, and then that turned into a book on the psychology of science.
Have you collaborated closely with others over the years? Who has shaped your thinking?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. As I said, I went to Berkeley to study that, but as it turns out, the people that influenced me the most were basically either retired or gone at the time that I got there. People like Don McKinnon, and he was retired, and Frank Barron had went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, so he wasn't at Berkeley. So those were the main people who really influenced me. But I did end up collaborating, ironically, with Frank Barron after I got my PhD. We did a follow-up study. So yeah. Other than that, though, it's kind of ironically, it's not a big field. There's not tons and tons of people in the psychology of creativity. And so I was always influenced as well by people like Robert Sternberg and Howard Gardner, who study creativity, and also intelligence. And so those were intellectual influences. And Maslow, even, all these, again, classic psychologists.
Do you agree with Maslow's? Because you brought that up. So I've listened to a lot of conflicting viewpoints.
Well, I mean, what aspect? I mean, do you...
that basically, do you agree with the idea that creativity happens, at the peak? I mean, when you've sorted all the levels and then...
Well, I would actually say that he argued something slightly differently. In fact, he was pretty clear on, okay, what you're referring to is the peak experience.
The pyramid, yeah.
Yeah, the pyramid. The
pyramid, which shows
the hierarchy of
the
needs.
Hierarchy.
Yeah.
That creativity only happens after all your basics are taken care of.
Well, but you know what? Actually, he said that about self-actualization, but not about creativity.
Really?
In fact, yeah, he was actually very clear. In fact, he pushed against this idea that creativity was only for the arts and the sciences. That he argued for everyday. He called it self-actualizing creativity, but what he meant by that was anyone could be creative. You didn't have to be an artist or a scientist or a musician or a writer. So he really did talk about creative living, creative life, much more broadly than your profession. So that was one of his. But yeah, I mean, so ultimately, it is also true that the people who are self-actualizing, one of their traits is creativity. But he did not argue that you could only be creative if you were self-actualizing. So that was one way, but that was not the only way. You could be creative and not self-actualizing. So anyway, so that part, yeah, I mean, it had a bit of an influence on me, but it wasn't a major thing. I do like the idea of the hierarchy of needs. I think there's some, especially the growth-oriented needs.
Right. I personally have a different take on that, in the sense that I personally felt that creativity happens and could happen at any level, even when you're totally struggling, when you don't have enough of anything. In fact, my understanding is that people have had to really think differently when they don't have anything, rather than when they're very comfortable. Because I've seen the opposite. The kids of famous people rarely ever reach those levels because they have everything. The need, the hunger is much lesser.
Well, right. And by the way, I don't think Maslow would disagree with that, actually. And what you're talking about, I think, is absolutely important and true, which is that if you're happy with things, you're not going to be driven to create. You need to be somewhat dissatisfied with things. You either because of necessity, you need to figure out how you're going
Yeah.
to eat, a meal, and you don't have enough resources, or you have to be curious and realize, there's something there that doesn't make sense. I need to figure that out. So dissatisfaction is absolutely, on a critical driver of, well, dissatisfaction maybe is overstating it, but curiosity anyway. Curiosity is always, I don't know what that is. What is that about? Why is that? And absolutely, and then we'll talk about that in a minute,
Yeah.
maybe.
So I think it's basically that you need to have the hunger.
You need
for
to have hunger,
something.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you are right though, that people who grow up with everything given to them and having a comfortable life, they typically don't do a whole lot. I completely agree with that.
Although it could be much easier for them. They have access to so much more, but there just isn't that hunger.
And by the way, that taps into what we were talking a minute ago about, it's absolutely true that, especially in the U.S., it's first generation people and who are often most driven because their families sacrifice so much to come here.
Yes.
And so these kids who do really great in science competitions and then go on and get PhDs, and so on. A lot of times they're absolutely driven because they came from very little, and their parents sacrificed so much to get here. And whereas the second, third, fourth, fifth generation people, if they've started to live this middle class or even life, they're just not as driven. You're right.
Yeah. So looking back, what drew you specifically to the connection between creativity and scientists?
Well, it was really
rather than just psychology.
Well, it really was. There's no doubt that my year in Germany, with my host father introducing me to the philosophy of science. In fact, so I was always interested in scientific knowledge as one form of knowledge. I mean, that's, again, part of epistemology and all that. So, and I was absolutely convinced that this idea of people often, when you say that you're interested in creativity, they often think, oh, I'm not creative, I'm not an artist. It's like, well, no. That's only one domain of creativity. They don't often think of scientists as being creative.
And why do you think this misconception? Why is there an automatic link? Because I've had this so often with people coming to me and saying that, oh, I'm not creative like you. And I said, what do you mean by that? So they say, no, we don't paint or sing. And I wondered that I know so many people who are artists who I feel are not creative at all. So, so why is this automatic association?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is just not knowing. Like when I tell people I'm a psychologist, they immediately assume that I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm not. So that's just all they know. So all they know about creative people is the arts, and they don't know what goes into science for one, but a lot of other areas of life too, architecture, so they just don't know. And
do you think that a reason could be because artists are supposed to articulate their feelings, their passions, what drew them towards making this piece of music or creating this piece of art, like they contemplate, whereas scientists depend a lot on discovery? Do you think on how things come? Do you think that perhaps that could be the reason?
Yeah, I think, I do. I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of... The thing about science is, I mean, the prototype, of course, is Einstein. Everyone thinks of Einstein, and everyone knows how creative and brilliant he was. And imagining as a 16-year-old kid riding in an elevator traveling at the speed of light and what would happen to a light beam, that just took an amazing leap of imagination. Now, he was a theoretical physicist. He wasn't an experimental physicist. He wasn't working in a lab. So I think that's the other thing, is that the lone genius scientist, thinking up things and so on. Most people think of a person in a lab, and that is true. But but creativity is just solving important problems in a novel and meaningful way. And the biggest problems, just to jump ahead, I'm really enamored right now with Demis Hassabis. I don't know if you know who he is.
No.
He is the
Sounds
CEO.
vaguely familiar,
He's the
but
CEO of DeepMind. It's an AI company that was bought out
yeah.
by Google in 2014, I guess. And he just won a Nobel Prize. He's like in his 40s. He's really young. Um, and because he applied AI to solve the AlphaFold problem, is what it was called, or what their AI was
Mm-hmm.
called. It was the protein folding problem. So anyway, he and his team, and they solved this problem that had been taking 60 years for biology to come up with. There's 200 million proteins, and maybe 1% had been solved. And he realized we could use AI to solve this. And it took a few years, and it did. And it's fundamentally changed. He won a Nobel Prize for this in 2024. It's fundamentally changed chemistry and biology and medicine. And so people don't realize that's, thinking about the big problems in life
That's
is
creativity.
absolutely creative.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is PR, and they're not as, they tend to not be as as you said, like expressive, and they're not in the public view either.
Yeah.
Most
Yes.
scientists are not very well known, whereas artists, musicians, writers, and so on, if they're well known, they're in the public eye.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, it is interesting. I've always thought, that it's just such a narrow view of creativity to think of.
And I started to, some of these things came up in my research because my whole topic is kind of redefining creativity. So in that, I found that this concept of the lone genius was because before we just had these whatever creative icons that you
Right.
had these people, and then when creativity studies actually began with Guilford actually coming
Right.
out and putting out the word and spreading the word. So at that time, more and more ideas started to converge, and then we were able to actually see that every human has creative potential. They may or may not act on it, but they certainly have creative potential. And so I think that in our times today, we are very open to the idea that creativity is for all, and I guess that's what all of these studies are trying to indicate.
I mean, the way I think about that is that, like everything, there's a spectrum. Uh, I would not argue that anyone and everyone can be an Einstein or a Picasso or a Mozart, that level. Just like being an athlete, not everyone's going to be, the best athlete in the world, but everyone can get better. Everyone has potential, and everyone with practice can absolutely improve and get better. There's no doubt about that. But and we'll get into this maybe, but that's where I find the 4C model of creativity really
Yeah.
relevant. Is that the big C creativity, the ones that change the world, basically, the change
big Cs,
disciplines,
yeah.
that's pretty rare. And just like only a fraction of 1%.
Once in a century, or
Yeah, just and also again, just like with athletes, only one fraction of the people who ever play sports are good enough to
would
go
get that.
to go professional. And that there is definitely a natural talent element to this. But absolutely, children, there's no doubt that all children in our brain, and I'm writing a book on creativity and meaning, by the way. And one of the things I get into is the evolution of the human brain. And the brain is really about making sense of things. Besides keeping the animal alive, it's really about taking in from our senses all that's happening, and just understanding what it is, making sense, literally making sense of it. And so the creativity is just taking those things that are coming in and that other people may or may not notice or think about or being curious about. And so our brains were meant to solve problems, to understand, to figure out what's going on. And so highly creative people are just some people who happen to be able to have a wide range of ideas. But everyone does this. Everyone, if you're curious enough, you can absolutely solve important problems in an original and hopefully meaningful way. But yeah, I mean,
Do you believe in the right side and the left side of the brain and all those studies?
well, that's complicated. I do not. I teach intro psych, and I have a textbook in intro psych. Um, I'm not a neuroscientist by training, but I read a lot about it, and I've read about. There's a guy named Ian McGilchrist who does the best stuff on this. If you're familiar with him,
Yes.
and so this old 1970s view of the right brain being creative and the left brain being logical and mathematical, that's almost,
And they say that there's that middle, I'm not sure what they call
it's
it.
the corpus callosum.
Yeah, corpus callosum.
Yeah,
which kind of, it's supposed to help interpret and sort of join both. That's what
Well,
my
and so
little knowledge is.
that idea of that split brain in that way is kind of meaningless and not very valid scientifically. But having said that, there's absolutely a holistic, the right hemisphere really does come up with the aha moment, the whole, so here's a classic example. I teach about this. So when people do have that split brain surgery done, so they're epileptic, and they have to cut the corpus callosum, disconnecting the two hemispheres. And then you show them an image of a face made up of pieces of fruit. So the fruit, like there's a cucumber as a nose and things for an eyes, but it's actually just different pieces of fruit, but it forms a human face. So there's the parts are the fruit, and the whole gestalt is the face. So when you show this image and you can do this, so the right hemisphere, my right hemisphere, is coming from the left visual field. So if you show that image on the left visual field, you have the person looking straight ahead, and you show it, and you make sure it goes only over into the right hemisphere, they see the face. But if you have them turn, and then you have it come from the right hemisphere into the left, they see only the fruits, pieces of fruit. So they see the parts. So that's really the way the hemispheres work, is it's more holistic versus parts. It's not creative. And by the way, there's a lot of neuroscience now on highly creative people, and highly creative brains are much more, their neural networks between the hemispheres is much richer, and more developed. So they have a lot more cross-hemisphere communication. So that's why this idea of the right hemisphere being creative and the left hemisphere being logical is not really meaningful. But there's definitely, as I said, it's more about the big picture, which is creativity, versus the parts of the problem. And you need both.
The trees and the forest.
Yeah, you need exactly. You need the trees and the forest. And for whatever reason, people who are creative or maybe have a little bit more going on can see the holistic image and put things together, which is what creativity is, in a way that for whatever reason, less creative people just don't do as much. But yeah, so I think that's my view on the left and right hemisphere.
So, as we move towards creativity, and why to study it scientifically, let's begin with what's your definition of creativity?
Well, I take a pretty standard definition. Most people in the field define it this way, although I have a slightly different spin. I always, when I teach
give us the slightly different spin. I mean, give us the standard first.
Well, the standard is original and novel thinking on the one hand. And that's, by the way, of course, as you know, no doubt, what most people think of as creativity, novelty and originality. But then I always use the example of a schizophrenic, someone who's suffering from schizophrenia, very original, very novel thinking, but it doesn't make much sense if they're hallucinating or whatever. So there has to be something else, and that something else is what the traditional view is useful or adaptive thinking. I like to think of it as meaningful. because to me, useful seems too pragmatic. Like what's the use of a poem or a work of art or a song?
Exactly.
There's no
Yes.
use in it, but it's very meaningful. Whereas someone who's suffering from schizophrenia is talking in a very original, novel way. They're saying things and having ideas that no one else has thought before, but it's just not meaningful. So you need meaning and originality to be creative. So that's my slightly different spin on it. I put the meaning rather than useful spin on it. Right. And then, as we talked about a little while ago too, within creativity, there's at least I do buy into the 4C model. The mini, small, professional, and big C creativity, because creativity is not creativity is not creativity.
Yeah. So, Greg, I had a question for you that how does this idea sit with the systems model by Csikszentmihalyi? Because he says that for novelty, which is the beginning of an idea, you begin from where the field has ended or at its last part. What I mean by that is, for example, if I'm a singer, I have a natural talent for music. But when I was young, if I was not taught music, I couldn't begin from trying to invent the note. It took several hundreds of years to find do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, all the 7 notes. And so I would have to have been taught music. So I would have to be at the level of excellence of the domain before I could really think of contributing something new to it. So I've always wondered about the mini c and the small c. That is it fair to really place it at the same level as the pro C and the big C? Because if we talk of personal creativity, I mean that it's important to have different distinctions so that we understand things. But I've wondered that would it even just be fair to evaluate a pro C and a big C with with what we call a mini C or a little c? Because I feel that's just a part of growing up. That's just a part of maturing. Why call it creativity? That's my only problem.
Well, yeah, I see that, and I kind of agree. I don't think that the mini and small c creativity. I mean, that was kind of the Bagetto and Kaufman's idea that
Yeah.
they were trying to argue that this is just individually creative. It's creative for that person.
Yeah.
It's not creative for anyone else because it's new to them. They never knew this, so it's novel
Right.
to them. It's novel and meaningful to them, but everyone else already knows it. So it's very limited. And yeah, so why even call
Yeah.
that creativity?
And I think a lot of confusion happens because the definition only says novelty and usefulness or a value, whatever. It doesn't really give any details about
Right,
that.
right.
And so,
Well, the other way
you
that
could.
my other spin to this, the 4C model, is the breadth of impact of the idea or the solution. So mini and small are very, very localized. They're at the individual level.
Yes.
Professional C starts to be much broader than that. Someone who's like a scientist or a writer or a musician, and so on. They're having an impact. Their work is
I
their
guess
ideas.
that's the most used is the proceed.
Yeah, and so they're having an impact that's maybe regional or national. Their work is novel enough. But then the big C are the people who have the impact both across time and space. Historically, you don't have to be historically. I mean, very, 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 very few people ever have impact. Forever.
Yeah.
For long decades and centuries and so on.
Yeah.
There's even, well, anyway. So that's the way I think of it, is what's the scope both in time and space
Yeah.
of impact that your idea has. So the bigger the impact, the closer it is to big C, the smaller the impact. So that's how I tend to think of it, is you're like, what's the scope of impact?
Yeah, and I do think I do agree that we need to just start seeing everything because there's just so much confusion on the topic. I think that this field lacks philosophical first principles, which other domains have. And it's suffering because
Right,
of the lack
right,
of first
right.
principles. We just don't know how to, how to arrange things, how to, in which bracket, what fits where. It's
Yeah.
confusing.
Well, it's interesting. You say that. What I think of too is that before the 1980s, personality as a discipline was kind of like that.
Mm.
Like they had all these different measures of personality, questionnaires, whether it was Cattell's or Guilford's or Eysink's or Harrison Goff's. And then in the 1980s, people said, we got to bring order to this. And the Big Five emerged with factor analysis and all that from those. And all of a sudden, that gave a first principle, to use your language, of personality. All of a sudden, now everyone knew what personality was. Not everyone 100% agrees, but it gave order and organization to the field. And I think you're right that creativity doesn't quite have that yet.
Yeah.
That the field of creativity isn't quite as there's not these organizing principles of the.
And I mean, that's why I think there's so many debates like, can you teach creativity? For me, it was a no brainer that no, you cannot teach creativity because the minute you try to teach someone something, they have lost their character. Now they're trying to imitate you and do things according to you. And
Well, yeah,
you can teach skills. You can
right,
absolutely, and you
right.
must. You can teach people language, grammar, but you can never teach them what book they should write. They're the authors. They have to decide what matters to them and why they need to at all write a book.
Well, and so yeah, there's a lot there. In the art, this is one area I see a distinction between the arts and the sciences. In the arts, it's ultimately about finding your voice, whatever
Yes.
that is, whether it's writing, poetry, painting, music, singing, literally finding your voice. And it takes a long time. So people always start off, even if you're talented in these areas, you start off, and you have to start off being influenced by other people. You kind
Absolutely.
of imitate them, you learn from them.
And you just learn. You
And
have to
then, but
learn the
where you
skills
become creative is when you become unique. You
when
found
you
your
express.
your
Yes.
your voice, your
Mhm.
perspective, your ideas. And now all of a sudden you're different from other people because you found your path that's different and unique. And so, but that takes a while. It takes even for, so,
Absolutely.
right. Now, right. So you can't really teach that, but what you can do is you can model it, but you model it in a way that you're showing that it's not follow me, it's find your own
Yeah.
voice. And that can be modeled in some sense, but some people do that more easily than others.
Yeah.
you
And
know.
I feel that there's so many things to be actually taught. So, skills, organization, there's a lot that
Right.
needs to be taught. It's just that spark or just being who you are. That's something that should not be taught. It cannot be taught. Even if somebody sets out to do that, it wouldn't be possible.
Well, to me, it's also kind of like this idea that, especially in the U.S., people talk about finding happiness, being happy. Well, as it turns out, being happy can't be a goal unto itself. It has to be a
Mhm.
byproduct of living the right kind of life.
Right.
And so you can't be creative on demand. Creativity is something that happens when you do the right thing and when you think about things differently, and that, yeah, you're right, that can't really be taught very easily. It can be shown. Again, this is kind of what I said earlier. Why is it that Einstein had this imagination as a 16-year-old? Why is it that Picasso did what he did? These really, truly groundbreaking, revolutionary thinkers, Darwin, Feynman, or whoever works of literature, James Joyce or whatever. You can't teach that, but they have to be driven. And this is where I'm getting into my more recent research on origin stories, is the drive to create, not just the
Mhm.
personality traits, but what's the motive and drive?
Mhm.
And my simple answer is it's all about meaning. It's all about trying to find meaning in the world. So scientists, I'm overgeneralizing, but scientists are trying to figure out the world, and artists are often trying to express their own perspective, their own interpretation of the world in a unique way in whatever medium they are using. So it's an internal expression, but that's their way of making sense of their own experiences, whether it's through writing a novel or a poem or singing or painting or whatever. It's making sense of what they're going through, what they're experiencing. And then scientists are trying to figure out if you're a physical scientist, you're trying to figure out the world, and if you're a social scientist, you're trying to figure out people. But you're always trying to find meaning, understanding, sense of your own experience or the world, and that's what our brains evolved to do.
Yeah. There was a very interesting perspective shared by Dean Simonton,
Oh
who
yeah,
studies geniuses.
yeah. I've worked with Dean. Yeah, Dean, yeah.
Ah, interesting. So what he shared was that he kept bringing up Michelangelo, and he didn't bring up Leonardo da Vinci much. And I asked him, why aren't you really bringing up da Vinci? So he said that, well, he was a creative human being, but he didn't really do or practice a lot of creativity. And I said, really? Why do you say that? So he said that he barely finished any of his work. He was just so interested he was a scientist, he was an artist, he was just a very curious human. And so he was led from one thing to the next, but for creativity to happen, you have to meet the criteria of novelty, but usefulness as well. So it has to land in the
Right.
world. And
Well,
Da Vinci
yeah.
didn't end up finishing a lot of his work. So
Well, that raises, yeah, exactly, and I can see what Dean is saying there, and I sort of agree. It does raise the interesting question: is this is the classic philosophical question? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, if someone were truly, truly creative and never expressed it, like in their head they were really,
yeah.
really creative, or they did it, or they did all these things and no one ever knew about it, would it be creative? Well, by my definition and by most people's definition, not really, and I think that's what he's implying, is because it has to have meaning for other people. There is, so that second criterion for creativity of usefulness, meaningfulness is a social criterion.
Yes.
It has to have an impact and meaning and use for other people. So if it's all yourself, if it never gets expressed or never has an impact outside of you, it could be creative in the original sense, in the novel sense. It's very, very, it has the potential for being meaningful and useful, but it's not. And so I think that's what he's referring to with Da Vinci. Now, everyone knows Da Vinci is the probably the world's greatest genius. I mean, and that's what Dean studies as much as anybody, is genius. And so, but yeah, I guess in that sense, his works were not all that useful.
Yeah. I mean, that got me to think differently because I'm a huge Da Vinci fan.
Oh
and
yeah, so am I.
Yeah. So this helped to, sort of put things in perspective for me. So Greg, basically, can you sort of explain how the scientific aspect comes to your creativity work? Because they're seen like two separate things, and I'm very curious to sort of understand that.
Let me just clarify the question. Do you mean the scientific aspect in the sense that I'm studying creativity in science?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so again, it goes back to what I started off by saying is, philosophy of science and history of science are two very well-established disciplines, especially philosophy of science. It's one of the bigger areas of philosophy in the 20th century anyway. And in fact, so again, I was always interested in knowledge and knowledge creation, but then more specifically, creative knowledge creation. And that's what science is. Science is ultimately creating new knowledge, not just knowledge, but new, original, creative knowledge. And so I realized, in fact, when I was in graduate school and had this real strong training in philosophy of science and psychology, and then all of a sudden a couple of books came out, and Dean's was one of them. Dean had a book called I guess it was called. Was it just called? No, it wasn't called. It wasn't the Genius book. It was like Origins of Scientific Genius, I think is what it was called, which was a psychology of science book. And then there were other people who wrote a book from basically it was on the meta science. It was this, and Maslow was the first to use that phrase, psychology of science. So I realized that is absolutely what I do. I'm interested in the psychology of science, and especially the psychology of creative science. And so my dissertation was on that. I interviewed all these National Academy members in physics, chemistry, and biology. And then I wrote a book in 2006 on the psychology of science and the origins of the scientific mind, making the argument that we need a psychology of science because scientists are people, to state the obvious, but it's not a discipline. It's not a field.
Right. Yeah.
The way the history of science is, the philosophy of science, the sociology of science. Those are all very well established disciplines. So that was the argument I made in my book in 2006. And it worked for a while. I mean, we started a discipline, we started a field. I was the president of it, and we had a journal for a little while. And then when I kind of turned it over, it kind of somewhat died, basically. Because as it turns out, studying scientists is, I would argue that Piaget, for instance, we have to expand what you think of science. Science is just theories of the world, models of the world, and we all have models of the world. Every person on the planet has a model in their brain of everything they understand is a model. And so science is just a continuation of that. So I think that scientists are some of the most creative people, and absolutely we need to understand that. And so when I did my meta-analysis, the work that's probably been cited more than any other paper of mine, I was on personality and creativity, but I split it up by science and art. So I wanted to see if there were different personality patterns of the highly creative artist versus the highly creative.
Yes, I was just coming to that.
Yeah.
How do you separate these two, and what were the different things you found?
Well, first of all,
differences.
let me talk about the similarities, because this is, out of the big five. So the big five is, I'll just say it in case
Please
may
do.
not be completely familiar with the big five. So the big five is it basically says there's five major.
So this is a personality test, the Big Five.
Yeah. Well, it's a test, but it's a theory now as well. But yeah, it's a model. It's a model of personality, really is the best way to think about it. And the model says there's five major dimensions of human personality. And it's somewhat cross-cultural, universal, not 100%. But so here are the five dimensions. The easiest way to think about it is ocean or canoe, because those are the same first letters. So let's do ocean. Ocean is openness for O. C is conscientiousness. E is extroversion. A is agreeableness. And N is neuroticism. So these are all five major dimensions of personality. So openness is being curious about the world, being open to trying new things, wanting to explore, being flexible in your thinking, versus really liking the tried and true, what you're familiar with. And some people like that. Some people don't like novelty and new experiences. They really are more comfortable and at home when they are with what they know and have experience with. So that's a dimension of personality, and that's the one. Now I can answer this question: what do creative scientists and artists have in common? Openness to experience. All creative people are really driven by that, have that personality trait. They explore, they're curious, they wonder, they ask questions, they try new things, they explore, they try new things both behaviorally and cognitively. So they might go different places, like we were talking about earlier with travel, that opens up your mind.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes people don't necessarily travel, but they have a very open way of thinking about things. So
Yes.
openness to experience is the main personality quality that is at the foundation of creative thinking in both art and science. Now, and the other one, so let's say what I found in some of my research on scientists was that the really creative scientists were seen by others as being somewhat hostile and not agreeable. They were very self-confident, but to the point of being a little gruff and rough, personality-wise. So, yeah, that was one of the main findings from my dissertation. And it was funny, a journalist picked up on this paper that I wrote way back in the early 90s. And she interviewed me and about this study about hostility and creativity in science going together. And then her opening line of her article when she wrote this up was, "Greg Feist is a nice guy. Too bad for him." Meaning that I'll never be creative. I mean, which of course is kind of silly, but it was a good way to get the point across of what the finding was. But anyway. So there is this association, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, there were some really creative scientists who were also nice and all that. The other quality of personality that tends to go with creative thinking is extroversion broken down into two parts. See, extroversion has a leadership dominance component. Like the people who are really extroverted tend to be social leaders and kind of dominant. And that's kind of the hostility or dominant finding that I had. But the other side, the other component to extroversion is the other side, which is what most people think of when they think of extroversion, is sociability.
Yes.
And so creative people are not necessarily all that sociable. So they, in fact, if anything, they tend to be on the low end of extroversion, so introverted. So that tends to be associated with creative people, creativity, both in the arts and sciences. They tend not to be social butterflies. They tend not to, go out and belong to big groups of people and so on. Again, these are all generalizations, but
yes, no, and you're absolutely right. This is what they they force themselves just in their work environments to just, they know that there's no way to avoid that. And so they create themselves so that they're able to get that done.
Well, because when you think about
Communicate
it,
well.
yeah, creative people need to be by themselves more. They need time
Yes.
for reflection. They're not as, because if you're always with other people, you're not able to, you just don't have time really to think up and think
And
for
since
yourself.
it's a psychology, it just creates a whole bunch of other problems. Like, do they like me? Am I pleasing them enough?
Right,
Etc.
right,
There is
right,
like
right.
no end to
Yeah,
everything that comes
so
from there.
Virginia Woolf's "A Room of One's Own" was a classic kind of way of thinking about that. Is you need time for, so creative people, and this goes back to Frank Barron too. You need to be both outgoing and inner and outer looking. You definitely need time by yourself for reflection, for thinking, for whatever.
Yep.
And so those are the main personality qualities. And conscientiousness, for instance, is one of the big C. That's the C in the ocean model. That's one of the differences between the artist and the scientist. As you can imagine, highly creative scientists, and this is what I did in this meta-analysis paper, I actually looked at scientists compared to creative scientists compared to less creative scientists. And when you make that division, what you see is that the less creative scientists are higher in conscientiousness. They like order and organization and discipline, whereas the more creative scientists are actually lower in that dimension.
Interesting.
They're not, because really creativity is kind of bringing your own order to chaos in a sense.
Yes.
You like things not making sense, and then you want to bring your own order to it. Whereas, highly conscientious people just like order for order's sake.
Right.
They need things in their place and everything.
Mhm.
So that was one of the interesting findings on that. And then neuroticism is anxiety and negative affect and proneness to that. The whole question of mental illness and creativity is a huge one.
Yeah.
As it turns out, creative artists are more prone to having had adverse experiences, emotional experiences, and probably being more prone to affective disorders like anxiety and depression, and maybe bipolar. It's not a requirement at all. It's just that some people who have those emotional issues, for lack of a better word, are again trying to figure it out, and you use that as a springboard, as a fountain for your own creativity. If you're really sad and something really traumatic has happened, one of the ways to make sense of it is to write a song about it, or write a novel,
Yes.
or express it in your painting, or do something with it. It's a very
Yes.
creative form of therapy, really, using your own creativity to work through
Yeah.
your own inner.
Yeah, your own pain converts into something
Right.
meaningful.
And there's a lot of examples. I mean, many, 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 many artists have
Yes.
talked about that, of course. So that's something that's different also. Scientists tend not to have that background for the most part. You don't see too much emotional, affective disorders in highly creative scientists. So that's one of the, but that kind of taps back into what I was saying earlier about artists kind of working through internal stuff and scientists trying to figure out external stuff. Again,
Right.
overgeneralized, but yeah, so those are some of the similarities and differences between creative
Oh,
artists and scientists.
that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and you're an artist as well.
Yes, and that's why this really completely made sense to me. And it actually seems so obvious when you explain it that yes, that's how it's going to be. Uh, just seems pretty like you don't even have to actually argue the case. It just makes sense.
Although sometimes things that make sense aren't always true.
Uh-huh. Yes, yes. A major strand of your work asks how scientific interest and talent develop in a person. When does a scientific mind start forming?
Well, yeah, I've done research on this, and now more recently, and I'll just use this as a way of talking about this most recent research, these origin story studies that I've been doing. So I've always, one of the problems with studying creativity is that how do you get creative people to study? They don't want to come in and do questionnaire research and all that. And so, like all of us, AI is taking over recently. And at first, I was really kind of resistant to some of the aspects of AI, especially as a professor. Like students are all going to use it now to write all the papers and all this stuff. But then I started thinking more about it, and I realized, well, one of the things that AI is really good at is pattern recognition, finding patterns in data in a way that humans can't really do, or at least not nearly as fast and as efficient. And so all this stuff, and I had been working on getting a web page together called The Drive to Create. And I wanted to have people who are creative tell their own origin stories. What drove them to be creative? How did they become creative? What was their early life like? And then all of a sudden I realized last summer, when I was thinking about all this, I realized, oh, I can actually do something much better. There's all kinds of interviews out there, including my own. I interviewed creative scientists and other people. But there's a lot of podcasts out there, for instance, or the Nobel laureates, for instance, since the 1990s, all give an interview, which is on the Nobel laureate webpage, about essentially how they got into science. And then there's other ones, like there's Growing Up in Science out of New York University and other universities, where scientists are giving their own kind of the unofficial biography, as they put it, not the official biography, like where they went to school and who they worked with, but what was their personal story. on how they got in. So I have all these different sources. I have 5 or 6 different major sources of origin stories. And then I realized, oh, let me use AI. Let me use Gemini. I started with ChatGPT, but as it turns out, ChatGPT, especially last year, it's so inferior. It's more of a language model, and so it's only predicting the next word, whereas Claude is reasoning about
Yes.
things. Anyway,
Claude, Perplexity, all these are.
yeah, so I use Gemini and Claude to, what I tell them is, here's dozens of interviews. I literally feed in the interviews, whether they're transcriptions or oral, and I say, find the themes. Just find the themes. I don't even tell them what the themes are. I just say, find the themes. And so what it finds, and then I do, because I have 2 raters, I have Gemini and Claude, and then I do iterator reliability, just the way you would with anybody. And then you adjudicate the differences. You have humans adjudicate discrepancies, but the reliabilities were actually really pretty good. And then what I do is I then feed the common definitions of each theme. So you ask the AI to tell you, okay, how did you define this theme? Okay, what was your definition? So they literally, and they'll tell you, they'll say, okay, this is my definition of let's say having a mentor, early family mentor experience, or having an adverse experience, or having a serendipity, something unexpected happened in their career. Anyway, so you do all this and you find these themes. And so what I found, to answer your question now, is there were some real common themes here. And so, for instance, let me see, I'm going to look this up here real fast just to make sure I get this right. Some of the common themes in science were, they had a very strong interest in science as children. Like even, and sometimes that's because of a teacher or a family member. Sometimes it's just their own curiosity. But they remember back in their early childhood of just really wondering about something in particular, having a real strong curiosity, fascination about. Many of them also have inspiring mentors. And then in the arts especially, having an adverse experience early in life. And that's not always true just in art. Like, people go into science sometimes because a family member died of cancer, maybe a parent, or suicide or something. And then they become driven to understand that because of that personal experience with it. And then the other big thing is that this idea that creative, successful people have this linear career path, like they were always really doing well in school, and then they did well in graduate school, and then they just got the best jobs. That's not true. That's a myth. There's really nonlinear. Most of the best people in a field, they got rejected, they had failures, they had adverse experiences, they changed careers. So this idea that you have to do really well early in life if you want to be successful later in life, that's just not true.
Doesn't hold true.
There's a lot of paths to being at the top of your field. So anyway, that's a kind of a longer way of saying is that early childhood experiences are formative in most creative people. And so there's a saying that we say in psychology, but it's not just true in psychology, is research is me search. Is artists and scientists are often doing things as adults, exploring questions, devoting their whole lives to questions that are absolutely personally relevant, driven by some personal experience. And I think that's the motive, that's the drive, that's the
intrinsic motivation.
Intrinsic motivation, because it really means something to them when it's personal. Even if it's like Hassabis trying to do the AlphaFold problem, well, he decided at 13 he wanted to create an intelligence, an artificial intelligence that solved the world's biggest math and medical problems. And he did, and he won a Nobel Prize for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Greg, I just feel that I just didn't notice how time has flown
Oh,
just
yeah.
speaking with you.
So am I. Yeah,
And
it's already an hour.
it's like we could just keep going.
Yeah.
So I was wondering that after decades of studying creativity, what is the biggest unanswered question about creativity for you?
Well, I think the big one is still the obvious one. Uh, how does a creative idea happen? Why does a creative idea happen? What is it about a person's unique experiences and brain that all of a sudden comes up with this combination or insight that other people haven't had? Um, So I think that I actually do think I was starting. I got my PhD right when the neuroscience revolution was happening in the early '90s. I still think that the brain, you'll never be able to completely explain it by simply brain activity, but it is happening in the brain. But it's also happening in the context of the person in their world and their cultural. So it's always nature and nurture, as I tell all my students. It's always something internal, biological, but it's also external and cultural and social. And so this combination of a wired brain, a little bit different, but also different and open and wide experiences. But even then, that doesn't explain, like, why did this idea happen right then and there? How did that happen? Um, I just think that's still, we don't really know, and maybe we won't ever completely know.
Yeah, perhaps that's
You know, but I think that like all big questions, like consciousness, creativity, love, you know, um, just
there's
take,
that certain element of mystery
yeah. There's
which
always
will
going to be some
will
mystery,
always persist.
right?
Yes.
Which is fine.
Yeah.
Our
That's
brain.
part of the magic.
Right. Like our brain just is not evolved to understand everything there is. Like we can't understand
Yeah.
infinity. We can't understand the origin of the universe. That's okay.
Yeah.
We can try, but
We can try and we do keep trying. So
anyway, so yeah, I think that the still the to me the core central question that's still not completely asked is why this particular brain had that particular creative idea.
So Greg, before we close, is there any question that I should have asked you which I haven't?
Uh, yeah, I mean, we could, I've been thinking about this stuff for 40 years, so we could go on forever. Um, no, those are the big ones. You covered a
Yeah.
lot, and
Yeah.
I mean, I
mean,
guess the like you were asking, I guess the one thing is like the future of creativity. I do think that there's two big things about AI. Like how I'm using AI is as a
yeah. So
tool.
should I just ask you an AI question? That what are your thoughts on AI?
Well, and so I have two main thoughts of AI. So we talked about the two main components of creativity are original novel thinking and also meaningful and useful ideas, solution to an important problem.
Ricky.
So AI can generate, as a generative system, it can generate novel ideas without too much trouble. Novel in the sense that they're unusual
Yeah.
combinations. But what it can't do yet, and I have to always specify yet, who knows, 10 years from now when general intelligence, artificial general intelligence is really a thing, maybe it will be able to do this. But it can't do the leaps of imagination that Einstein did. It's trained on known knowledge.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's constrained by that. Whereas humans still have the capacity to go beyond the known uh, and imagine what if. What if?
Yes.
What if I were riding at the speed of light? What would happen to the speed of light emanating from me? That's an idea that an AI is not going to come up with.
And that's the unique power of the human to
Yeah,
always go beyond what is
right.
be done
Right,
before.
right. And most people can't do that. It's very hard, but some
Yeah.
people do, and they change the world. Those
Hmm.
are the big C creative people. Um, you know, and then the other thing though is that meaning, um, AI can come up with ideas and it can absolutely find themes and patterns as I'm using it, for instance, but it won't be able to understand the meaning of those
Yes.
um, in a way that
It's not felt anything.
it's not
There's
felt,
no
it's not lived,
felt.
it's
Yeah.
not lived
It's not
experience.
lived experience.
Right. And so that's the other thing, especially the arts require lived
Yeah.
experience.
I mean,
Um,
it happened to me. I heard some AI music, and initially I thought, oh, this is lovely, it's very nice. And then I was told that this was created by AI. And I just didn't feel like here. I just lost interest completely because it just seemed fake. That what's the point? It's not even real.
right,
And and so I just didn't feel like hearing it. And that's when the power of even imperfection. It sort of cleared things in my mind
right,
that
right,
I wouldn't have minded listening to something imperfect as long as it had that human quality to it, that
right.
somebody felt it.
And I think we're always going to have that. I think the
Mm,
fear of AI taking over and ruling people, I think is overblown and kind of nonsense. That's not how
yeah,
AI
yeah,
is going to
yeah.
work. But there's always that human quality. Now, I mean, who knows? Maybe 20 years from now, AI is going to get to the point where they can really simulate even that, but they still will never have lived experience.
Yeah,
You
I mean,
know,
I'm wondering that will the quality of humans change, that they don't really care about this anymore. Anything
right,
goes.
right,
That's what I'm really worried about. That
yeah.
are we going to look at a new breed of humans? You
Well,
know,
that's a different. Yeah,
that's
that's a
that's
different.
something that I'm really scared of,
Right,
even
right.
more than AI.
I mean, I
So
think AI has the potential for being the most transformative technology we've ever created, but also, yeah, some of the more dangerous as well. So it's both. It's solving problems in medicine and science and climate change and other things. It can make the world a better place. It also can make the world a much worse place if we don't use it
mhm,
right.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, and human interactions and all. By the way, I'll just end with this: is that there's a fascinating book that I'm reading right now by Michael Pollan called "A World Appears." It's all about consciousness, but but
Is
one
he
of the
the
things
guy who wrote the book on food at
yes,
one
he wrote
point?
a book on
Yeah.
food. He also wrote a book
This is,
on how to change your mind, which was about psychedelics.
mhm.
But and the psychedelics book morphed into this book on consciousness, a World Appears. And he makes the claim that other neuroscientists make that I completely agree with. AI is not conscious and it probably never will be conscious. Not everyone agrees with this, but I am for the exact reasons we're talking about. It's not lived experience.
Mm,
Consciousness has to be it's an experience. So even if
com-
a AI knows and it can reflect on what it's doing and thinking, but it doesn't have there's no death to an AI.
exactly,
There's
exactly.
no threat to it, even if we unplugged it or whatever. But
Yeah,
it's not driven by it a finite time or the
exactly.
fact
It
that you
has
could.
no motivations. It
It has
has
no
no
motivation,
reasons. Yeah,
right?
it's
And it's
completely
and
lacking in
so anyway,
motivation.
I mean, I think it's both great and
Yeah.
also not
I mean,
great.
I think it was created to be a tool, and that's what it is.
Right.
If we're going to make, I mean, it doesn't sound right to use the words like slave and master, but it was meant to work for us. It wasn't supposed to take over and become the
And I
master.
don't think,
And
yeah, exactly. And I actually absolutely think, and I'm doing it. We can use it to help us solve our own problems, but not as a replacement, but
yes,
as a mentor. Well, not a mentor even, but as a companion,
as a tool, yeah,
as a
a
tool, as a
companion, a
companion,
tool,
someone
yeah,
who can do things for us. It doesn't prompt itself, at least right now. We have to prompt it. We have to tell it what to
yes.
do.
Hmm.
It has no drive. It's
Whatsoever, yeah, yeah. You have to
oh
push it.
yeah.
Do
Okay.
this. Yeah.
Very good. Well, no,
Yeah. So
this has been very enjoyable. Again, we could talk
truly,
about.
Greg. I mean, time has just flown. I had a lot to cover, but it sort of flowed, and so many all the relevant aspects just got covered. So thank you so much for such a lovely conversation in which there was no effort to try to pull together the topics. They just kind of merged one into the other, which is, what I ideally look for in conversations. Okay, Greg. So
Shandana.
thanks. I'll be in touch, and this was really very, very enjoyable.
No, I
Thank you
enjoyed it. I
so
enjoyed it.
much.
I'm glad you.
Thanks a
I'm
lot.
glad you reached out. Okay, very good.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.